The night they laughed at his cabin, the wind was already practicing its howl. People pointed from their warm trucks and joked about how a man could be foolish enough to build a wooden shelter under a massive stone arch, half hidden by pine trees and shadow. When the storm comes, someone said, that place will crush him. They didn't know that as their laughter echoed across the valley, the man inside that cabin was staring into the fire, listening not to the mockery, but to the mountain itself, waiting for the moment it would test every choice he had ever made. That he was called Elias by the few who bothered to learn his name. Years ago, he had lived in town, worked a job that drained his spirit, and smiled politely at people who never truly saw him. When his wife died suddenly, the town offered condolences for a week, casseroles for a month, and then moved on. Elias didn't. He sold what he could, bought a stretch of rugged land at the edge of the valley, and built his cabin beneath the great stone arch that curved like a giant's rib over the earth. To him, the arch wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It broke the wind, deflected falling branches, and stood firm through decades of storms. The locals saw danger. Elias saw shelter. Every nail he hammered into that cabin carried grief, memory, and stubborn hope. He learned the language of the forest. How snow piled differently under the arch, how rain slid along the stone instead of pounding the roof, how the ground stayed warmer there in winter. He learned to be alone without being lonely. Still, whenever he went to town for supplies, the jokes followed him. "How's life under the rock?" they'd ask, laughing. Elias would nod, smile faintly, and say nothing. He had learned that arguing with mockery only fed it. Then came the winter that no one expected. The forecast promised a storm, but storms were common, and people trusted their sturdy houses and electric heaters. Elias noticed signs others ignored. Birds flying low and fast, the silence before dusk, the way the air felt heavy and sharp at the same time. He stacked extra firewood, sealed the last gaps in his walls, and prepared as if the mountain itself had whispered a warning. By nightfall, the wind arrived like an angry tide. Snow fell sideways, thick and blinding. Trees bent and groaned. Power lines snapped one by one, plunging the town into darkness. Houses built on open ground took the storm head-on, their walls shuddering as if they might tear loose. People huddled under blankets, listening to the world roar outside, and for the first time, some of them thought of the man under the arch. Elias felt the storm too, but differently. The stone above him split the wind, turning its fury into a low, constant hum. Snow piled around the cabin but not against the door. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting warm light across the walls. Elias sat with a mug of tea, heart heavy yet calm, when he heard it, a knock. Not the imagined knock of memory, but a real one, desperate and uneven. When he opened the door, he found two figures nearly buried in snow. It was Mark and Jenna, a couple who had laughed the loudest at his cabin just days earlier. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. Their house roof had partially collapsed under the weight of snow, and the road was impassable. "Please," Mark said, his voice shaking more than the cold could explain. "We didn't know where else to go." Elias stepped aside without a word. He took their coats, sat them by the fire, and handed them blankets. Shame hung in the air thicker than the steam from their wet clothes. Jenna's eyes filled with tears, not just from fear, but from realization. "We were wrong," she whispered. Elias nodded once, not in triumph, but in understanding. The storm outside showed no sign of mercy, but inside the cabin, something softer began to grow as the night deepened. More knocks came. A family with 2 children, an elderly man who could barely walk. Even the store owner who had once joked that Elias would be the first to go when nature sneezed. Elias welcomed them all. The cabin grew crowded, but warm. People shared food, stories, and quiet apologies. The arch above held firm, a silent guardian against the chaos beyond. When dawn finally arrived, the storm retreated, leaving the valley scarred and silent. Houses were damaged, roads buried, and the town shaken to its core. Those who stepped out of Elias's cabin that morning did so changed. They looked back at the stone arch and the simple wooden walls beneath it with new eyes. What they had mocked had saved them. The days that followed were filled with repairs and reflection. Word spread quickly about how Elias's cabin had become a refuge. People who had never spoken to him before now nodded respectfully, some even stopping to thank him. Elias listened, helped where he could, and returned each evening to his quiet place under the arch, but the true change wasn't in how others saw him. It was in how they saw each other. The storm had stripped away assumptions, leaving only gratitude and humility behind. One afternoon, Mark approached Elias with a toolbox and a hesitant smile. "We're rebuilding," he said. "Thought maybe we could help you strengthen this place too." Elias looked at the arch, then back at Mark, and for the first time in years he smiled fully. The next storm season came, but it found a different valley waiting. Neighbors checked on one another. Laughter returned, gentler this time, without cruelty. And beneath the stone arch, the cabin stood as it always had, not as a symbol of foolishness, but of quiet wisdom. People learned that strength doesn't always look like what the crowd expects, and sometimes the shelter everyone needs is built by the one they once laughed at. The night they begged for shelter became a story told often, not to shame but to remind. A reminder that resilience is often misunderstood, that humility can arrive disguised as disaster, and that the safest place in a storm might be the one everyone else ignored. By the time the second storm warning spread through the valley, no one laughed anymore. Phones buzzed, radios crackled, and an uneasy silence followed the announcement. Stronger winds, heavier snow, colder nights. People remembered the last storm too clearly, and almost instinctively, their thoughts traveled to the cabin under the arch, the place they once mocked and later survived because of. Elias felt the change before he saw it. Footsteps approached more carefully now. Voices carried respect instead of jokes. Early that morning, someone arrived not with fear, but with wood. Another brought canned food. A woman left a note at his door that simply read, "Thank you for showing us what shelter really means." Elias held the paper longer than he expected. For years, he had accepted loneliness as the price of peace. He hadn't realized how heavy that price had been. As clouds thickened again, people didn't wait for disaster. Families gathered what they could and came early, offering help before asking for safety. The cabin filled with quiet cooperation, hands reinforcing walls, sealing cracks, stacking supplies. Children sat near the fire listening to stories Elias never thought he would tell anyone. Stories of his wife, of dreams that once felt too fragile to share. Each word loosened something tight inside his chest. When the storm finally arrived, it came angrier than before. The wind screamed through the valley like it wanted to erase everything in its path. Trees snapped. Snow swallowed fences. But under the arch, the cabin held. People sat shoulder to shoulder, not just surviving, but connected. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled the room. They sang softly to calm the children. They laughed quietly, not out of mockery, but relief that I in the deepest part of the night. When the fire dimmed and the wind seemed unstoppable, Elias stood and spoke. Not loudly, but firmly. He reminded them that shelters aren't just built from wood and stone. They're built from patience, foresight, and the courage to stand alone when no one understands you yet. No one interrupted him. Every word landed where it needed to. Morning arrived slowly, pale light filtering through falling snow. The valley was wounded again, but this time prepared. When people stepped outside, they didn't scatter back to their separate lives. They stayed, planning repairs together, checking on the weak, sharing what they had. The cabin under the arch became more than a refuge. It became a lesson carved into memory. Weeks later, when the snow melted and roads reopened, Elias noticed something new. The valley felt different, kinder, quieter in the right ways. Children waved when he passed. Neighbors stopped by without storms as excuses. And though he still returned each night to his simple cabin, he no longer felt alone beneath the stone arch. The people who once laughed now understood something they would carry forever. Strength doesn't need approval, wisdom doesn't need applause, and sometimes the safest place in the world is built by someone brave enough to be misunderstood.